I suppose, picking up a wee bit on some of the stuff Frank was talking about, I want to try and address some of the moral dimensions of moral panic. When Viv and Gary and myself were speaking about what we might focus on in this final seminar, some of the work that we've been doing, our attention is turned to the idea of the way that some of these issues have been presented as sort of juxtapositions of good and evil, good and bad. And we decided to pick up on some of that sort of evil dimension in some of these issues, some of the moral panics that we've come across. In doing so, I think again Frank suggested that some of the earlier literature on moral panics actually comes from theology, and we felt that that kind of perspective might be helpful, but also a perspective that derives from cultural history. And what we were, I think, determining is that we need to move beyond the purely sociological concept of moral panic as it has developed to identify some of that moral dimension, some of that dimension that comes from what we might think of as the soul, or as Ian Hacking suggests, the soul overwritten by the psyche. The best person to have done that, I think, would have been the author Richard Webster, who described himself as a cultural historian. But he wrote a brilliant book on the North Wales child abuse scandal, The Secret of Bruneston. You see the term there, demons of the dark, this idea that some sort of demonology enters into the way that we think about everyday panics. Richard unfortunately died a few years ago. In a pamphlet that he wrote in 2009, he mentioned the author David Frankfurter, who's a theology academic at Boston College, and we did approach David Frankfurter twice, and he knocked us back on both occasions. But he had this book, Rumours of Demonic Conspiracy and Satanic Abuse, and the word it's cut off is history. I draw quite a lot in this presentation on Webster's work and on Frankfurter's work. Can I just actually say what I forgot to say at the beginning, is that I was going to focus a bit more than I am on some of my current work, which is looking at allegations made against Jimmy Savile. And if anybody wants to know more about Savile, then I am picking up one of the workshops this afternoon. Somebody has pulled out of the first series of workshops. So I'm picking up on one of those with one of my research collaborators here, Anna Raccoon. So Anna and myself will be doing a workshop in the first block this afternoon. Okay, Richard Webster, this strapline to his book on Bruneston, The Secret of Bruneston, is the making of a modern witch hunt. And when he talks about witch hunts, it's not in that sort of throwaway sense that we very often do these days. He actually draws substantially on the work of Norman Cohn and his book Europe's Inner Demons. And there's Cohn's essential argument that the book is concerned with a fantasy and its consequences. That fantasy was in the Middle Ages, but the essence of the fantasy is that it existed somewhere in the midst of the Great Society, another society, small and clandestine, which not only threatened the existence of the Great Society, but was also addicted to practices which were felt to be wholly abominable in the literal sense of anti-human. Cohn goes on to argue that the fantasy changed, became more complex down the centuries. It played an important part in some major persecutions. So it's that bit of fantasy and the consequences of fantasy when that idea of fantasy gets into the sort of collective psyche. So here's the witches' Sabbath, the inversion of this Christian Sabbath that witches used to gather under cover of night in sort of dark clandestine places and essentially turn on its head some of the goodness, if you like, of the idea of a Christian Sabbath. And what you used to do in these meetings were all sorts of abominable things. Babies or small children were ritually slaughtered, feasts at which the remains of victims were ritually devoured, erotic orgies, every form of intercourse, including incest between parents and children, freely practiced, in the worshipping of a strange divinity in the form of an animal. Now that seems as though it's something from an entirely different millennium. Of course it is, it's 2,000 years ago. But as Cohn said in the earlier quote, some of these fantasies have a persistence. They don't go away. And that particular fantasy re-emerged in the Orkney Islands in 1991. Again, I'll just let you read that, and you can see the sort of similarities between the 2nd century witches' Sabbath and what happened in Orkney 24 years ago. Okay, fairly uncanny sort of resemblance. It becomes a bit more problematic when we find out that the master or the minister was actually 68 years old, suffering from angina, unlikely to be able to hook kids in and engage in all sorts of sexual acts. But the persistence of that fantasy amongst those involved actually continued to the very end, when they were handing back stuff that had been taken from them. Again, I'll let you read that. But everyday items, 2 hoods, 1 black coat, 3 nativity masks, 2 academic hoods and 1 priest's robe. Hardly surprising that a priest might have robes or academic hoods. And those of us who are academics and who have our own robes perhaps should be worried. But the idea, I think what the idea of the Sabbath, that sort of inversion of good and bad, I think it takes us into a sort of theological incursion, and I have no real qualifications to enter into that. My background actually is in history, and I do have some idea of some of the early modern witch hunt stuff. My theological insights come from the fact that I certainly was brought up a Catholic, probably hang on in there, so it's a very, very much a sort of folk Catholicism. But the idea of the fall, that we fall from grace into darkness. The religion, the Manichees, suggested that sort of divide between goodness and badness was absolute. That idea of a sort of dualist conception of good and bad, an understanding of the world that sees it as a struggle between a good spiritual world of light and an evil material world of darkness. Good and bad, darkness and light. Catholic theology, on the other hand, I think picks up on a more sort of Aristotelian theme, developed by Augustine, Aquinas. But this notion that as human beings we had an orientation towards the good, that the idea of sin takes us away from that notion of the good, but the general direction is in the direction of good. But we are all sinners, and I think that sort of idea is encapsulated in the story of the woman caught in adultery, and Jesus' exhortation to the crowd, "Let the one amongst you without sin cast the first stone." So this idea that we are moving towards the good, but the idea of sin gets in the way of that. And I think that links again with Frank's idea that that was a moral language. We had a moral language to understand some of what was going on there. And you might think that we learnt a number of lessons from Orkney. We certainly moved away from some of the sort of satanic ritual abuse scares that were around in the 1980s and 90s. But some of the same cast of characters, some of these moral entrepreneurs and claims makers still exist. One of them in particular, Valerie Sinison, resurrects the idea of demonic conspiracies in relation to the Jimmy Savile case. Again, rather than read it out, I'll just let you read it. This is an excerpt from the Express newspaper. So not only was Savile sexually abusing kids, adults, he was doing it in a sort of satanic, demonic fashion. If you look on the internet, as I have been, about Savile, evil and that kind of thing, one bright spark suggests that if you look at the name Savile, you can put a hyphen there between the Sa and the Vile, and not content with that, you'd think that would be sufficient of us a pejorative epitaph, the idea that of vile, but if you actually work or rearrange the letters of vile, you get evil. Proof positive of the fact that this is the devil at work. So, but it's not just people on the internet that make such a sort of stark divide between good and evil in some of these issues. This is an excerpt from The Guardian. I'll come back to that because we think that it's the Sun, the Star, papers like that which actually take forward these moral panics. It's more complicated than that. It is an elite pursuit, as I'm going to go on to suggest. This idea that Savile was merely using his good works, his charitable work, as a way to actually do bad. So he was pursuing good in order to do bad. He was hiding in plain sight. He was such a conniving sort of character, such a clever character, that he was actually managing to do all this good work, be perceived on his death as some sort of saintly figure, but a year afterwards identified as that sort of demonic character that he is in the press currently. And a character that none of the novelists could actually capture because he was so sort of debased, so evil. Again, incursion into history. Yeah, picking up on some of Christopher Hill's work on the sort of English Revolution and the idea of Puritanism and the Puritan sort of cosmology, that Richard Webster here identifies Puritans as attacking sexual love, but not just sexual love, any form of emotional expression, romantic love, wonders of affection. This notion that evil was associated with the body, with carnal desires, but not just sexual desires, also any sort of form of affection, emotion. And most zealous Protestants set out to repudiate, repress, or systematically destroy these carnal desires through godly discipline. And the Puritans, whilst they didn't last particularly long in England, they went across to New England, and as this is an article actually, 1928 article from Bertrand Russell, but they colonised the American Midwest, and the end result of that is that Puritanism has become a sort of persistent strand of the American sort of psyche, if you like, in the American political system. The end result of that, as Bertrand Russell was suggesting in 1928, is that the greatest power in the world is controlled by men who inherit the outlook of Cromwell's Ironsides. And there you have this sort of conclusion of that sort of trend. George Bush, the President of Good and Evil, I think Pete Springer has written a book with that title. But this idea that the world was split into good and evil, at the time Bush was identified with as a sort of Manichaean figure, that he saw the world in these sort of stark terms. Okay. What Bush's thinking and the kind of thinking that it exemplifies is it actually does introduce a new dualism to the way that we think about social issues. And Bush spoke about the axis of evil. Anybody will know that you can find all sorts of entertaining quotes from George Bush on the internet. But I think this is a sort of instructive one. The Second World War, we learned there is no isolation from evil. We affirmed that some crimes are so terrible that they offend against humanity itself. And I'll pick that up again later. And we resolved that the aggressions and the ambitions of the wicked must be opposed early, decisively and collectively before they threaten all of us. That evil has returned and the cause is renewed. Richard Webster talks about child protection in his case being a revivalist movement. This idea that children are subject to some evil threats is a revivalist idea. It keeps coming back at us. And it's picked up increasingly by some current authors. I was listening to Sue White speak a few weeks ago, and she introduced this idea of the sacralized child. And of course, the sacralized child has got to exist alongside the dangerous adult. So we've got the sacralized innocent child, the dangerous, depraved, corrupted adult. So this idea of, again, probably corruption, the fall. And many of the most powerful historical fantasies involve children and our need to protect them. Okay. So again, this idea of protecting the innocent. There you have a picture which I think perhaps picks up on some of that juxtaposition of good and evil. I think a story that's not been told is the story of what happened in Jersey back in 2008, I think it was, where you have Port de la Garenne Children's Home in the background there, and Lenny Harper. I couldn't fit in his dog there into the picture, but the way that that's cast is that sort of jaw set against evil, the evil in the background there, and Lenny Harper setting out to root out, to discern, to root out, and to address evil. And I'll tell you why this came about. I was reading that Lenny Harper had actually retired to Ayrshire, and when I was thinking about this kind of stuff, I was walking to work one morning, and it was Burns night, and I was thinking about some of Burns' poetry there, and there's Holy Wally's prayer. So again, I'll let you read it in your own sort of Scottish.
I think you should read it.
You reckon?
Yeah, it's got a poetry. Read it.
Okay. O Lord, thou kens what seal I bear, when drinkers drink and swearers swear, and singing here and dancing there, with great and small, for I am keepit by thy fear, free frae them all. And then have the sting in the tail, but yet, O Lord, confess I must, at times I'm fashed with fleshly lust. He was saying in poetic form what Richard Webster here is saying in a more prosaic form, and it's picking up on this idea of Puritanism, that the more you cleanse yourself, the dirtier you get. What Luther was implying or implicitly recognising was this fascination with sin, that the more any particular form of human behaviour, appetite or impulse is cast into the realm of the unclean by those who pursue purity. This idea of purity is something that Viv has written about. The more psychologically compelling it becomes, the pursuit of purity thus actually serves to promote an imaginative obsession with anything that has been explicitly or implicitly defined as obscene. I was reading some stuff around by an American academic, Amy Adler, about the sort of responses to pornography. And what she's saying is the more you actually respond to pornography, the more attractive you make it. So this notion that we're attracted to the obscene, and very often responses which seek to address what we perceive to be obscene actually feed it. Webster talks about this process as being manifest in what he calls a pornography of righteousness. I don't know if anybody knows this guy. Okay. Mark Williams Thomas, who has discerned Savile's evil, who has been responsible for some of the initial sort of rooting out of Savile through his Exposure television programme. He's a man for all seasons. He's an ace detective, he's an award-winning journalist, he's a child protection expert and a criminologist. So a real man for all seasons, as I say, or perhaps I've got the wrong Arthur Miller play there. It might be The Crucible, which actually reflects some of Mark William Thomas's behaviour more aptly. But this pornography of righteousness, I don't know if anybody has followed his Twitters, it's bizarre. He has a number of sort of updates on the trials of ageing celebrities, and then he intersperses that with, isn't this a lovely picture of a cat, or didn't Wales do well in the rugby? But there's a couple of his quotes, or his tweets. Sometimes we find out too much. Do we stand by our principles and evidence, or do we join other flock and walk on by? I know where I must stand. This standing out against evil, standing against the face of evil. But he's got what seems to be a sort of prurient sort of attraction to some of the detail of the court cases. So you have Stuart Hall would pour champagne on one of his young victims' naked body and flatter her. He treated her as his plaything. There are a whole number of, he seemed to have a particular thing about the size of Max Clifford's penis as well in some of his tweets. But fascinating insight into that sort of psyche which picks up good and evil. And you might think that we don't believe any of that anymore, that that's something from a different age, or it's something for the common people, for the mob. And again, Webster, I think, is instructive in his take on that. The widespread belief that belonging as we do to a rational scientific age, we're no longer vulnerable to such fantasies. That, according to Webster, is one of the most dangerous of all our delusions, for it's precisely because of our rationalism and the difficulty we have in acknowledging our own violence and the full depth and complexity of our sexual imagination that we are probably more susceptible to dangerous projections than ever we have been. I was speaking to Stephen just at the break there, and he was talking about Derrida and Paul Ricoeur's ideas about evil and locating them within the whole modern project. Other writers, Zygmunt Bauman comes to mind, would similarly locate this idea of evil as a problem of modernity. And the point that a number of people have picked up, this is not the mob, it's not the Sun readers, the Star readers, it's a sort of establishment pursuit of evil. Ruling elites, this is a quote or a partial quote from Good and Ben Yehuda's work on moral panics. The ruling elites cause, create, engineer or orchestrate moral panics to deflect attention from more serious social issues. That's one of the reasons that I, as a social work academic, am interested in this, because the question for me is, if we're focusing on the sexual behaviour of ageing celebrities, what are we not focusing on? And one of the things for me that we're not focusing on is the kind of real poverty which children and families live in, which forces them to use food banks. That's the real evil of our age, which is unspoken when we actually locate evil primarily with sexual morality. And according to Webster, this elite pursuit is actually pursued more perniciously than it ever was within religious discourse. There's no crueler tyranny, he's quoting Montesquieu here, no crueler tyranny than that which is perpetrated under the shield of law and in the name of justice. But this notion of evil, which seems to fuel so many of the sort of social anxieties of our time, what is it? According to Frankfurter, it's actually a state of mind rather than a tangible or a verifiable reality. It's a way of thinking about otherness. Martha Nussbaum, she was another one that we invited to this, and she knocked us back. That's why I'm standing up here, all these knockbacks. So we project our own unease onto others, identifying them as evil to our own good. Properties pertinent to the subject's own fear of animality are projected onto a less powerful group, and that group becomes a vehicle for the dominant group's anxiety about itself. Okay? This notion of othering, which is very much around in sort of sociological literature, picked up there by Nussbaum, that when we actually become anxious about other people, we are actually demonstrating an anxiety which is about ourselves and our own human nature. But those responses to ourselves, the way that we shy, that we step back from those, we shy clear of them, and they are manifest or expressed in terms of demonisation, sometimes with humanitarian undertones. They're grossly, or the responses are grossly disproportionate to the event or the activities of the individuals concerned. That's Jock Young, and that's where some of the moral panic theory does actually start to ring very true. It's not that there's nothing there. People are generally concerned about some real social anxiety. The question is the proportionality or the disproportionality of the response. And this final quote for me is one of the most powerful ones. Again, it comes from David Frankfurter, and he suggests that the real atrocities of history seem to take place not in the perverse ceremonies of some evil cult, but in the course of purging these cults from the world, real evil happens when people speak of evil. Okay, and it might be summed up in the old phrase, speak of the devil and he's sure to appear. But real evil happens when people start to imagine evil, when they start to speak of it. And some of the real atrocities, if you look back to the witch hunts, and I think it was Malleus Maleficarum, the sort of manual on how to root out witches, witchcraft was identified as crimam exceptum, an exceptional crime, based on the notion that witches were so evil, cunning, and dangerous that normal rules of evidence could not apply. You couldn't actually deal with witches through the application of normal rules of evidence. It was crimam exceptum, an exceptional crime. And exceptional crimes needed exceptional responses. So those exceptional responses actually were manifest in doing away with what might be considered to be normal evidential safeguards from the court system, because these were insufficient to actually root out witches. Okay. And again, this point was made by Bertrand Russell, that the practical objection to Puritanism as to every form of fanaticism is that it singles out certain evils as so much worse than others, that they must be suppressed at all costs, crimam exceptum. The fanatic fails to recognise that the suppression of a real evil, if carried out too drastically, produces other evils which are of greater danger. Okay, this notion that the response to evil sometimes creates greater atrocities than the evil that we are seeming to respond to. And in the criminal justice system, what we have is the doing away with what might be considered normal evidential requirements. Alison Levitt, in relation to the Saville case, notes that the term complainant is inappropriate, and she substitutes the term victim throughout the report on Saville. If anybody wants to know a wee bit more about some of the detail around that, then Anna and myself will speak about that this afternoon. Another evil, again my own background in residential childcare and the way I got into this kind of literature was on looking at some of the disproportionate responses to allegations of abuse in residential childcare. Throughout the 1990s, 8,000 residential workers were implicated in abuse allegations. And that's continuing. It's continuing on the say-so of guys like Steve Messam, who has been responsible for reopening some of the North Wales inquiries. Not the kind of guy who you would bet your house on. Not particular. I don't know how much of the detail people know, but Steve Messam was basically identified in the Waterhouse report as an unreliable witness then, but he's being used to create or to resurrect some of the North Wales inquiries now. Webster talks or suggests that we compound a historical ingratitude to residential care workers by demonising them. This notion of seeing them as demonic. And an example of that, I don't know how many people have followed too much of the Saville case, but was it the Daily Mail picture of Miss Jones, who's the former headmistress of Duncroft School. She's now 93 years of age. She's being investigated by the police for allowing children or girls to be abused in Duncroft. That, I would suggest, is an evil that we should be concerned about, that we are starting to prosecute or allegedly, or perhaps persecute 93-year-olds. Okay, coming to a conclusion, Hannah Arendt talks about the banality of evil, and again, sticking on a residential childcare theme, Marie Keenan, who has looked at the Ryan report in Ireland and researched some of the sort of cases there, suggests that ordinary men walk their way into abusing children. It's no longer just about paedophile priests, but about you and me. It's not good and bad, dark and light. It's all of us as sinners within that sort of middle ground. She suggests that new thinking is urgently required, In that new thinking, she suggests, demands that we start stopping to talk or stopping talking in terms of this dualistic view of good and bad, good and evil. We need to start reconciling the idea of good and bad, grace and nature. And again, I'll let you read this quote. It's my last one, but it comes from a journal which I can't remember the title of, but it's something about mortality, death and dying. But it had a brilliant article about the Jimmy Savile case, which I think probably just draws to a conclusion what I've been saying over the last wee while. Okay, that's me.